Good afternoon, good evening, whatever you want to call 5 p.m. where I am, but in the winter it sure feels like evening. I'm happy to be speaking to everybody today, and this is California Convictions. My name is Aaron Channel, and I served, it was 16 and a half years in California penal system. It was a rough place to do time, by and large. And one of the things that I don't think gets talked about enough is prison food. It's a strange thing to say, but by and large, the food that you eat while incarcerated, it's not bad. I don't mean it's the best stuff you're going to find or that you write home going, oh my gosh, that burrito was awesome. You need to come to prison and try it. I just mean that it's way above any standard that could reasonably be considered as cruel and unusual. You get enough for starters. County jail, not always. There are a lot of county jails where you just don't get enough to eat. But prison? Yeah, there's enough there. Even if it's not what you want, perhaps you wish you had more meat, more cheese, and more dessert. If you're willing to eat the salad or, gosh, the stewed carrots or whatever the stuff that nobody else wants is, and you're willing to go, hey, fellas, let me eat your stuff you don't want, nobody would ever go hungry in prison. There's plenty of food that gets thrown away, and that's a pretty easy earmark of whether or not there's enough food to go around if there's food being thrown away. I had one friend, Robbie. And that was what he did. I asked him, hey man, you seem pretty happy all the time. And he was. What's your secret? And he explained to me that he worked out like a beast, and he did. He was 5'3", 5'4", not a big dude, but he was stocky. And he ate anything he could. He ate like a madman. Played guitar. He said, I wake up, I do those three things. I do them as much as I can. I treat them like a job. And at the end of the day, I'm tired, I'm well fed, and I've had all the guitar that I could possibly want. What more do you need? There was a lot of wisdom in that type of attitude. But as is often the case, what sounds good on paper was a little bit ugly in person because the dude really meant it. He ate like it was his job. At the chow hall, he would try to time his entrance so that he would sit near the trash cans so that anybody who was throwing away food, he could go, hey, let me get it. And everyone in the building, the 200 inmates that all ate together every day, they knew it was a joke, like the old commercial, Mikey likes it. The joke was, Robbie will eat it, and they'd pass it down, whatever it was, this slop or the rice with unidentified white sauce on it or unidentified green sauce. The stewed vegetables that have been stewed for so very long that there's not actually any vegetable left in it. All it is just some kind of vegetable water with husks floating on the top. Heck yes, Robbie will eat it. At the time, I think I made fun of him just a little bit in my head. Dude ain't got no standards. He'll eat anything. But looking back and realizing that Robbie had real time, he was, doing the next 20 or 30 years of his life in a place just like that. And that he attacked life every day. He'd eat and he'd work out like a fiend, running around that track, hitting a couple of burpees and pull-ups, and then running around again. He'd do it until he was destroyed. And then we'd share a giant lunch, and I'd listen to him play the guitar for a little while. For a short period of time, there was a conversation about him teaching me to play the guitar, but unfortunately I lacked the manual dexterity for it. This was before I got coccidioidomycosis there at SADF, which really affected my hands. They clawed up pretty impressively. They healed, thankfully, but I didn't get back some of the fine motor skill that I would have liked to have. That's another story for another day, I suppose. Robbie was a beast when it came to working out. And there are very few people who are going to care about the prison nomenclature, about how much burpees he can do and how many times he can run the track. But man, he could hit cardio for like 20 minutes just running and making himself red in the face and maybe stopping to do just a couple of pull-ups or a couple of push-ups. And then just sit down for 5 minutes and relax and talk, and he was up to do it again. Every couple hours, stop to have a giant meal. End of the day, he was happy. Good enough, I guess. After all, that's what life is. It's a series of days, and if you can be happy at the end of it, that's an accomplishment in and of itself, especially if you can enjoy prison food. Because that random rice with a random colored sauce that nobody recognizes, or the meal that has a fancy name like Hungarian beef goulash, and you go, ooh, I like Hungarian beef goulash. But the thing is that you go there and you can't tell the difference between the Hungarian beef goulash, the chicken tikka masala, and the yakisobe pork. The three meals look and taste very, very similar. So you call them slot meals. You can have whatever you want that you tell Sacramento you're feeding the inmates, and the menu looks great. But I don't think most guys could have told those three meals apart, and that says worlds about the actual quality of the food. And I'm not playing the world's tiniest violin for those poor malnutritioned inmates back at SAD-F. The prison's bad. By and large, it should be an unpleasant experience. This point is made that if prisons were awesome, people would want to go there. And you shouldn't want to go to prison. That said, there shouldn't be extra effort put into making food worse. You shouldn't have somebody in the back making sure there's enough hot sauce that nobody can enjoy their food on the yard with elderly people that have eating problems. That's cruel and unusual punishment. It's essentially torture. Whenever I left the line and became an SNY inmate, I was placed into a section of the prison called the Protective Management Unit, or the Placement Management Unit. That's PMU. You can place that in correlation to, for instance, the Segregated Housing Unit, SHU, the SHU. The PMU was an okay place to do time, except that most of us were there because we had problems on the mainland. We were rolling up. That means that you're no longer going to be okay with the gang you were a part of. And there's a real chance that if they get the chance, they're going to come at you. They'll kill you if they can. Just on principle. They don't have to know you personally. It's just a matter of who's on what side of the fence. Back there in the PMU, for a short period of time, they had inmates from the main line making our food. The story was that they didn't know what carts were going to what building, so it was unlikely that they'd do anything untoward or literally poison the food that we were receiving. But that's based on the idea that the kitchen officer, whatever officer is in charge of making sure that the carts, it isn't known what cart goes to what building, actually cares. In reality, I'm sure there was all kinds of unpleasantness that they managed to sneak into our food, like mop water and personal fluids. I was fortunate. You want to talk about prison food? My family was sending me money. I was prison rich, and it's a funny thing to be prison rich because it only costs you $40 or $50 a month. To be prison middle class, at least, to where people look at you and go, oh yeah, Aaron's got money, he can get something if he needs it. 40 or $50 a month is also enough to buy top ramen soups and maybe some Zoom Zooms and Wim Wams to trade so that you don't have to eat any of those slop meals. The Hungarian beef goulash that the guys from the main kitchen are making and sending to you, the SNY inmates. It stopped. At one point, somebody chipped a tooth because there was a piece of gravel in his hamburger patty. You want to be realistic? That piece of gravel could very well have come from a different kitchen. It could have just been in a hamburger patty. I got plenty of pieces of gravel in my hamburger patties while I was incarcerated. But he made a big deal out of it. And it was an actual injury that he was able to log, and he had a little piece of gravel, and as a result, they started letting us make our own food. That was cool. Back there in the PMU, Channel 5 says, "Hey, superstar, I'm back." Back there in the PMU, it was only about 200 inmates. And they were all waiting to be placed onto an SNY yard, placed wherever they're going to go. So we got to know each other real well. We were in a shared housing for about 6 months, a year. And nobody was leaving. We were all just there waiting to go somewhere. The guys that got the kitchen jobs and a couple of their friends set up an arrangement where they would take food to the kitchen. They were taking all kinds of good stuff to the kitchen and then mixing it up with the stuff that they had at the kitchen. I was donating spices. A friend of mine was tossing in all of the tortillas they could want. And they were coming back with the best stinking burritos that I probably ate the whole time I was locked up. There is an element of trust in allowing inmates to make your food, of course. You have to be careful. You can't trust an inmate. In the same way that those guys on the line were doubtless doing unpleasant things to the food that I hope I was able to avoid. Well, inmates also do that kind of stuff to the guards' food if they can. I had one acquaintance, Hell's Angel. He had a good name in the gang. And he worked as the MAC rep on the yard. He could go anywhere. He knew all the cops. He made killer burritos. He would grill them up with some homemade guacamole paste, and he'd smear some oil on them, and he'd toss them onto a George Foreman grill that he'd made. Do you know what a George Foreman grill is? That's where you get the metal sheet that you sleep on. And you scrub it, you take something metal to it like a pair of fingernail clippers until it's nice, shiny, clean stainless steel. And then you get a candle and you put it under that piece of metal. And you can toss stuff down on it and that grill gets nice and red hot. And he made screaming burritos. And he'd make 20 twice a week. And he'd give 12 to his friends. He'd save 4 for him and his cellie. And he'd give 4 to officers that he was acquainted with. And he told me, about half the reason that he went to all that stinking trouble was so that one of those 4 officers that he gave burrito to would have eaten a whole bunch of unpleasantness that was his secret ingredient whenever serving that one officer. Dude made 40 burritos a week. Enjoyed some, spread some around. He had the money. But he told me that his real reason was because he knew if he made enough, it wouldn't be suspicious if he offered one to the one dude he really had a problem with. I guess if you got that kind of time and inmates do, there's another way to be unkind with food in prison, and there's an element of trust in allowing anybody to prepare your food. Back there in the PMU, just about everybody of that 200 inmates, they weren't prison rich. You can't subsist on what's coming out of that canteen. So they just sucked it up and they ate what they could. And this is still so far. I'll talk about cell behavior in just a minute. Why? This is still just so far away from that standard of cruel and unusual punishment. Of course, if the cops know that something is happening, somebody chipped their tooth on a piece of gravel, then they need to get involved. They need to change the rules. But everybody was a little unhappy. Oh gosh, our food is nasty. And yes, it's a cringe thing, and I really prefer not to think about it. But if you consider what prison conditions have been, even just 100 years ago, imagine explaining to somebody, well, there's enough and it tastes great, but, it's not sanitary. That line for cruel and unusual punishment is the standard which determines whether food is going to be good or bad in prison. And thankfully, ours is great. YLY in the comments asks, Aaron, can you talk about cell behavior with your cellie? Who cleans? Who gets top bed or lower bed? Is there a toilet pecking order? Man, I could do videos, plural, on social dynamics of living in a cell. One thing you have to understand is that it matters how big the cell is. A 180 cell, that meaning that you're on a level 4 yard and you have a maximum security situation where you and your cellie are both in the highest security setting without actually being in the shoe. Your cell's big. There's enough room for you and him to exercise next to each other and then walk over to your bed. Conversely, some pens, you go to San Quentin, Old Folsom, there's not enough room to anything. Like if you want to get down off of your bed and your cellie is standing talking to his friend, you got to tell him, hey, can you get in your bed so I can get off of my bed and do my thing? There's no room. It's very small. So the first thing that's determined in cell social dynamics is basically who has the right to be in the cell, who says, hey, excuse me, let me have that space. It's generally the guy who was there first. The guy who was there first refers it to as his cell. You say, well, you moved into my cell, or you're moving out of my cell. It's a subtle thing, and after somebody lives there for long enough, I'm sure that it fades a little. But yeah, absolutely, it's a seniority thing. Unless there's another reason. Unless maybe the guy who moved in is a scrapper. He's willing to fight over whose cell it is. Or he's sneaky. He's willing to ride a kite to the cops saying that there's some drugs hid somewhere and his cellie knows where they are, by golly. Or whatever his move is that he can do to take control of the cell, it generally belongs to the guy who was there first. And the guy who was there first is going to set up rules. This is the way my cellie and I did it before. This is what I'm used to. And it's understandable. You're coming into a new situation. You don't want to disturb the guy's program, but there's a giant caveat here. And that's if it's fair. A good example is consider television. Television is a lifeline to an inmate. Oh, it lets you find out what's going on in the world. You don't have a computer. You don't have a phone. Best case scenario, you have a TV and a radio, and people write you occasionally. So you want to listen to your TV. And you like listening to the news. That's what's important. You can find out what's going on. But you got a cellie like me. Do you know what I want to watch? I want to watch sitcoms. I like to laugh. Comedy. All day, every day. I don't care if the world is burning. I just want to watch The Big Bang Theory. Okay. So who gets to have the volume up in this little concrete box with real poor acoustics? Are we going to listen to your program or mine? It's a conversation you have real early. It's after, hey, let me see your paperwork. I want to know what you're in on. But no, it's a first day thing. If it's not fair if the guy says, well, I listen to my TV with the headphones off all the time. It's loud in here and you'll just have to deal with it. But don't you listen to yours or I'll get upset. Well, then it's a problem. And people get into fights over this type of thing. Or just move out. And that's always an option because this guy trying to push the unfair rule, in his head he knows that if you won't put up with it, the next guy probably won't either. So either he keeps playing that celly lottery looking for somebody who's just willing to put up with his crap, or he negotiates. And he says, well, listen, I really do like to listen to my news, so I want to be able to listen to mine. But how about that's just during news program times? And in exchange, I'll be the dude who cleans the cell 5 days a week, and you can just do it 2 days a week. And then you have kind of a conversation about, well, what does cleaning the cell mean? Because some dudes scrub walls, and I don't mean it figuratively. I've had conversations with guys who say, listen, I spend 2 hours a day scrubbing our 8 by 10 concrete cell. Why don't you spend your 2 hours doing it? That is, of course, one side of the spectrum. If we're going to be honest, I was on the other side of the spectrum. I can be a slob, biker status, they called it. And that's, hey, Aaron, dude, can you pick up the stuff that you dropped a half hour ago and you said you were going to get? And I go, oh, yeah, sorry, man. And, I get down and then maybe I hit the floor or whatever else that I was going to do in addition to it, because I feel guilty forgetting about the whatever it was. And so you try to find an accommodation because it's in both of your best interests. Some situations may sound lopsided. I had one friend and he was so passive, so quiet, had such bad social anxiety. I really had a lot of sympathy for him. And his big thing, he said, the only thing that I want is I want my cellie to sit down whenever he pees, because we share a toilet. And yeah, he cleans it afterwards, but it bothers me. And my last cellie sat, and it was his issue. There are 100 things you can worry about in a cellie. How clean is he? Does he snore? I've described my thing where I have sinus issues. They're gnarly. Doesn't bother most people. I had one cellie who after 2 days leapt up and chest puffed out. And all right, we're going to go. I can't put up with this anymore. You need to quit making that stinking noise. You mean the snort thing? Yeah, dude, you do it one more time, we're going to go, I'm telling you. And now for perspective, he is much, much smaller than I am. He must have really been upset. It was not going to be a fair fight. There are times whenever size is the entire conversation, and this was one of them. He wasn't a big dude. That's okay. But he was so angry. And I stood up and told him, listen, man, if that's what it is, and I understand that's what it's got to be, but you need to know I can't help this. It is what it is. And he backed down. We calmed down. He realized that he didn't want to get into a fight over something that was a medical issue. But he did move out because it drove him crazy. It was just that thing. Maybe your cellie stinks a little. Maybe your cellie cooks, but you don't like the things he cooks. He likes making weird vinegar cabbage dishes that stink up the cell, even though his hygiene is immaculate. Maybe he's got a project. So there's always little pieces of paper and detritus and glue on the walls. He's crafty. He's doing stuff, but, he takes up a lot of space, or he's loud. It's a basic game theory, because it's a zero-sum game. There are 100 things that you do living in that cell that drive people insane. And there are 100 things this dude does that he knows drive people crazy. But what are you willing to put up with? Because I don't want to play that cellie lottery either. And so most of these things are informally decided in a conversation along these veins, even though, of course, a lot of the things I said are unspoken. As far as who gets the upper bunk and the lower bunk, the lower bunk is generally the preferred bunk because so many inmates are older or have injuries and they need a lower bunk. From there, the people who prefer an upper bunk, it's easy for them to get one, and the remaining people who prefer a lower bunk have a hard time getting one. So it creates a system of artificial scarcity for lower bunks. Because of my sinus issues, my CPAP machine, I had a lower bunk chrono, which means that I had a medical restriction to always be housed in a lower bunk, because CDC wanted to be sure that they couldn't get sued because I fell off of the upper bunk in my sleep or as I was climbing down with my machine. Channel 5 says, wouldn't it be cool if some high-profile chef came in and did a show with the kitchen ingredients? That's actually a really neat idea. Because in reality, some of the stuff that, you have to understand how food gets to prison. Each ingredient comes trucked in some huge quantity, of course, because they have a big industrial kitchen. And some of the stuff that comes in is legitimately decent. Whole hams and beef of passable quality. But the inmates who are in charge of doling this stuff out, first, take their little cut off the top, the best stuff. And you understand why. They're actually taking things off a truck or apportioning what's going to go to what yard. They're going to get their issue. Then once it gets to the yard, well, the cook is going to take his issue and give some to his friends too. And again, it's going to be the best stuff. And sadly, this wasn't the best stuff that came to prison in the first place. Don't imagine that this is all, grocery store level food. A lot of the stuff that comes to the prison comes in big crates that say institutional use only, not intended for commercial sale. Doesn't necessarily mean it's poisonous, but it is letting your average civilian consumer know, don't eat this. It's not good. It's good enough for inmates, and that's the standard. So I would be legitimately curious to see what a decent chef could do with the ingredients that he had left over after the inmates had pillaged the best of the best and left him, what was left. I was not bad at cooking. If you let me go to a prison canteen, you can make some great stuff. One of my favorite things was to take chips, maybe some nacho cheese Doritos or something like that, and break them down with a little bit of water, roll them out like flour, toss in a top ramen soup pack, and then dry them and put them in a nice thin layer. And then you get yourself some decent meat, and that can be trickier, but you can order some decent meat out of a package or in the canteen, maybe some canned stuff. Or you can find that cook or that guy who's peeling the good stuff off the top. And if that guy is interested in eating some decent food, you tell him, look, I know how to cook. So you bring that actual good stuff you took off the top, and you don't need to pay me, you just need to break me off some of what I make. Oh yeah, that's a good symbiotic relationship there. I had my friend Mike, and he worked in the kitchen, and he could get all the best stuff because his job was to go to the main kitchen and bring back the big carts of stuff for our yard. He was the first person to see the things that were coming to our yard. And so that nobody else would steal the stuff, it was his job to divvy it up into all the little pieces and chunks and boxes it was supposed to go into, write down what had arrived because he was the clerk. He was in charge of ordering this stuff and making sure it was all there. So he had the best odds at getting the good stuff off the top. And I would take that good meat, maybe some pulled pork or some ground beef, and layer it inside of this tortilla that I'd made with the tortilla chips and the top ramen soup packet, maybe some garlic powder, some pickled garlic. You fry that up on your George Foreman grill, which, if you'll remember, is a bunk that you've taken, scrubbed all the paint off and everything, so it's just a piece of aluminum or steel or whatever metal they gave you. And then you put a candle under it. Let it get nice and hot, and you drop your burrito onto that with some olive oil. Listen to it sizzle. And you see guys for 10 bunks in every direction start looking over because they can smell it. That's good eating right there, and I'd love to see what somebody like Gordon Ramsay would do as a spin on that. YLY asks if 2 people can have a TV in the same cell. It's the kind of thing that's going to vary from institution to institution and yard to yard and prison and state to state. But yes, I think most states in the U.S., you can have a TV in your cell. A lot of them, in order to solve that whole conversation about whose headphones is going to work, they remove the speakers from the television. They also remove speakers from radios or anything like that, but this depends on state rules and laws. There's other places where they don't. Whenever I was at San Quentin in Badger section, it was all open tier. What I mean by that is that there's only a cage door, like a thin wire mesh, between you and everybody else. You can't see people because it's like in the movies where you're all in cells so somebody can walk past and look in. But you sure can hear each other. At a normal speaking voice, just, hey Johnny! And oh yeah, if Johnny lives right next door, he doesn't even need to raise his voice. Just, yeah, what's up, Aaron? Because there's nothing solid between the two of you. It's just wire mesh. Places like that if they don't remove the speakers from televisions and radios, it turns into just a cacophony, a battle of everybody's gibberish. You'll have a guy 2 doors down blasting his country music and somebody not liking it 2 doors in the other direction blasting their rock and roll or their rap. And then you have 47 guys just trying to listen to their TV program, but they need to listen to it loud enough to hear it, and so a lot of it washes out onto the tier. It is a disharmonious sound, all of those devices going at once. So institutions like that, where they have the open cell doors, or where they have dormitories where inmates don't have any walls between them at all, it's just a bunch of beds, they generally remove the speakers and require inmates to have headphones that they plug into their televisions. But most places let you have a TV, and I would think that any place that would let one cellie have a TV would also let another cellie have a TV. Channel 5 asks about birthdays in prison. You know, you can be really creative in prison. It's an environment where you make do with what you have. I recall an occasion in which my boy Tool wanted to throw a little birthday party for a friend of ours, Diddy. Tool went to the trouble of first getting a little Sara Lee cake that came in the Jewish meals. And that's nice, sweet treat to give the guy for his birthday. But then he went and made himself a stinking candle. It was just a wick with a little base on it so that it wouldn't get anything nasty onto the cake. But he got himself a light and he lit it and he sang the guy happy birthday and made a little peanut butter frosting off to the side. It's little considerations like that that establish a brotherhood. And that's what you often find yourself being a part of whenever incarcerated. Different brotherhoods, of course, have different traditions for birthdays. There are some groups where you would see people do something pretty funny, but also pretty unpleasant to the guy for their birthday. My favorite mean tradition that I'd see people do was they'd wait until you were showering on your birthday or near your birthday, and then they would walk by with a bucket of cold water and toss it into the shower, because understand, these showers are just bars. It's just a cage door. Everybody can see you, you can see everybody. And since there's nothing in the way, all they have to do is take that bucket and huck it in and get you in the shower. And that is one heck of a wake up whenever you're taking a hot shower and mind your own business to get hit with about 3 gallons of nice cold water. Of course, there's the classic birthday spanking or birthday beating. And yeah, absolutely, I saw guys chasing each other around. Take your birthday licks. Because, it's a bunch of kids who are trying to deal with being grown-ups and in prison. My first birthday in prison was shortly after I was arrested. I was arrested on October 5th, 2001. My birthday is on December 8th, 12/8/1980. So December 8th, 2001, of course, really stood out for me. I turned 21. That was my first birthday in prison. It's a funny thing because I've actually, to this day, never been in a bar, taken a drink legally. I have bought booze since I've been out just to prove that the ID actually works, but it was weird to turn 21 in prison looking at the death penalty that was still on the table at this point. I knew it was California, and it's not like they execute you quick. It takes 5 years, even 10 years to get around to putting that needle in your veins. But yeah, I remember my birthday. I remember doing the math on how many more of them I had left. Of course, it wasn't all bad. I had family, friends that stuck with me as best as they could, and at the end of the day, I went to prison, I got out, and I just had a birthday a couple of months ago. This little scar that in earlier videos was prominently displayed. I got that from falling, literally on the stroke of midnight on my 41st birthday. Funny coincidence, but those little moments in your life that make you realize how easy it would be to have that 40th birthday be the last one, have that 21st birthday, whenever they're talking about putting a needle in your veins, be the last one. Prison makes you think about your mortality. A lot of people there are literally waiting to die. That's what a life sentence means. We all understand the idea of the death penalty, putting somebody to death, but a life sentence is a strange thing to say. You're sentencing them to life in prison, whatever their natural life may be, so they're waiting to die. High Strangeness asks, how many people such as Lockdown, 23andOne, and how common are, fifis or toys? It's a difficult question to answer because, most guys who did have one or used one are going to lie about it. And it's quite possible that you could be on a tier with 200 dudes and you could be the only one that didn't have one and you wouldn't know. So it's hard to say how common that type of thing is because people don't talk about it. But I can tell you, I moved into a bunk one time and somebody had left their Fifi is a homemade prison sex toy. You can Google it or whatever beyond that. I don't feel the need to elaborate, but they left it in their locker in the back. That and enough beans and rice spilt in it that I think if I'd tossed some boiling water in there, I could have had the most disgusting meal that anybody's ever made. I mean, he just spilt a bunch of food in the back of his locker. It was awful. So there are some, but with that exception, the nasty dude who had left the building because he was a nasty dude, they'd rolled him out. And whenever I moved in, I found it in the back of his locker. Well, with that exception, I never heard of anybody admitting they had one, and I never saw anybody with one. But that said, I'm willing to bet there's quite a few of them. Dan Powell asks what I went to the Joid for and what video explains my story. I'm fairly new to the channel. No disrespect taken, that's a good question. Look, any of these, the prison YouTube thing is, it is what it is, but anybody who's not okay with tossing some paperwork up on screen, talking about their case just a little bit, I would just assume that they did something unpleasant. My video is entitled Some Facts About Why I Went to Prison. And in short, there was a murder, and I try not to speak about it at great length because one of my co-defendants, Ty Abreu, is still in prison, and I don't want to contradict his story. But I pled down on a murder case. There's no allegation of any kind of sexual impropriety or nastiness on my part. I was active for 6 years at High Desert B Yard at California. That means that I was involved in the gangs, at least insofar as I was allowed to walk on the same yard that they were. And then there was some unpleasantness going on there, and I went SNY, and I suppose I count as a rat for that, but I did as little damage as I could on the way out the door. And then I did the rest of my term at SAD-F in Corcoran, primarily, and then later at Chino and Chowchilla. These are SNY yards, so I was around a bunch of real creeps. So that's my basic story for what I went to prison and the things that paint my jacket a little bit, but I thankfully don't have any of the nastiness that some of them nudes did. D asks if I played a lot of Pinocchio. Man, Pinocchio was my game. I moved on to Bridge because Bridge is a much better game for 4 people to play if they really know what they're doing and they play an honest game. But Pinocchio is fun and everybody knows how to play it. Pinocchio is fun and everybody knows how to play it. You can roll into any building in California prison and just ask, hey, where's the Pinocchio game? It's like poker. It's just guaranteed that there's somebody who plays it or wants to play it. It's just a simple card game, but it's a lot of fun, especially if you happen to enjoy the company of the other 3 people at the table. 4 is a good social number. It's good for card games, and it's good for a group of people just sitting at a table talking. Not so many that you overwhelm each other with your stories, with waiting for a turn to talk. Not so few that nobody knows what to say. Shaliste Girl has asked, oh, excuse me. Shaliste Girl points out that scars have character. And she's absolutely correct. Scars is another thing that you see really a lot of in prison, because you have to understand that a lot of guys were actual outlaws. A lot of guys came to prison as the result of a time where they were willing to do what they had to. Perhaps they were driving a car and they decided to just go off that cliff and hope they'd make it through the other side. Maybe they set their home on fire, burnt along with their family, and happened to have survived. Maybe they were running from the cops and doing 80 and have no stinking idea how they woke up in the hospital missing an arm. I heard all those stories, and yeah, scars add character because those men were wearing their crimes out for everybody to see. People would point and say, don't you know, that's the guy that fill in the blank. That's his story for getting arrested. Arthur D. asks, as a coffee drinker, was coffee scarce or did I drink it frequently? I was prison middle class, or perhaps even prison rich, by which I mean that I had $40, $50, even $100 some months that I could spend on my personal welfare. That's a lot of money in prison, where they're already giving you your clothes and your food and whatnot, at least enough that you won't starve. Coffee, on the other hand, that you have to pay for. And that is the most common request. If you have a friend, a social acquaintance, somebody who might be willing to, have that money roll down the hill a little bit. Hey, Aaron, let me get a shot of coffee from you, man. Sorry to bother you. Can I get a shot of coffee? Hey, Aaron, you know what I'm hearing, man. Let me get a shot of mud. Hey, thanks for all that coffee you're giving me, Aaron. I appreciate it, but I'm sorry to ask. Can I get a shot of... If you don't have coffee and you're a coffee drinker, it's a miserable place, especially whenever other people do. Waking up first thing in the morning, being just a little poor, and having to choose between that top ramen soup that you've decided you're going to eat later because you got to get big, you got to get strong, you got to get ready. And that shot of coffee that you wanted first thing in the morning, you can only have one. And then you smell that dude next to you, that jerk Aaron, who's prison middle class. He has as much coffee as he wants. That aroma of Folgers wafts up. It's just instant, but yeah, it smells great first thing in the morning. Coffee was often a scarce commodity whenever there's a lockdown or just whenever canteen hasn't run for a little while. You'd have guys walking around offering, hey, let me trade 2 jars for 1. 2 jars of coffee for 1. You paid double in interest. And of course, there's a little bit of a gamble on the part of the guy that's lending you the 1 jar of coffee, because you might leave. Maybe this is your last thing you do before you parole or go tell the cops you can't be there. But you would often hear it, 2 jars of coffee for 1. I was fortunate that I often didn't do without. I'm more of a tea drinker, but you got to drink a lot of tea to get enough caffeine in you whenever you're trying to stay going. So I was able to supplement my caffeine requirements with caffeine pills, which they sell. Like no-dose type of things. You need to get them sent in through an outside supplier, and it's actually a little bit of a pain pill, if you will. But having just a month's worth of caffeine or a year's worth of caffeine under the locker was always a real relief. Because if you are an everyday coffee drinker, and then suddenly, because of things that have nothing to do with you, suddenly you can't drink coffee, and worse yet, the people around you still can, yeah, that's not a lot of fun at all, and people had to endure it. Channel 5 asks about dominoes, which was a big game where I was. A lot of people enjoyed playing dominoes. It's one of those games that it looks very simple whenever you start. And then little by little, you realize that the guys aren't just making random moves. They're planning out what's the next move and the next move, analyzing the possibilities and working down to the correct move they should make. That kind of problem-solving ability to look ahead, use your mental chalkboard, and come up with answers. If I do this, they'll do that. If I do this, they'll do that. It's called working memory. Essentially, how many things can you hold in your head at once? One of the guys that I saw best for working memory was the professor. And I'll talk about him again in some more videos, and he's an interesting character. I've enjoyed being able to speak about him at length. But it was incredible. I saw him sitting in a room with 2 or 3 other guys who were having independent conversations with other people, and then randomly pop in 10 minutes later and go, "But Frank, you said this." Dude just listened and heard and took it in. It's a talent that I never had, but what a wonderful talent to have. Dan Powell notes, "I'll remember to appreciate how much you engage your audience, considering the fact you'll almost certainly blow up soon, if not later. Much respect, sir." We'll see how it goes out. I'll be honest that I'd really love to be able to continue just engaging with my audience at this level. If more people want to listen, dude, I'll keep talking. But it's all great either way. I said to somebody the other day that whenever I started this, I had in my head the idea that maybe it would be profitable, but that I didn't mind spending the money to set up the camera and the mic and all that either way, because it was a gamble. And I have realized that that was a very foolish attitude. This isn't a gamble where I might get something out of it speaking on YouTube. It's the best therapy I could have paid for. I feel so much better for having talked about some of my experiences with any of you who will listen. Thank you for listening. I don't just say that. That's sincere. Because I don't know how I was going to deal with prison otherwise. You walk out of there and the world is not what you remember. And then in addition to that, oh goodness, I got a little choked up talking about getting out of prison and how much fun I'm having doing this channel. I wanted this live stream to be just under an hour. We're approaching 50 minutes. There's apparently an incredible delay between whenever I speak and whenever y'all hear me sometimes, because I finished my live stream the other day, and then whenever I got on to talk to a friend, they said, "But I can't be talking to you, you're still talking on your live stream." I hadn't realized that there's a 3-minute delay sometimes. I'm going to be wrapping this up in just another moment or two, and I told that small anecdote to drag out my exit. I just wanted to sincerely thank everybody one last time for listening to me talk about prison or whatever the heck people are interested in. I'm going to be doing my podcast with Uso Ron in a couple of days, and I'm going to continue doing live streams whenever I happen to feel up to it. Up to then and afterwards, this is a nice way to interact with my audience. And I do intend to put out some more actual content too. The story on the professor is still just kind of hanging there. Dan Powell notes that I have the voice and the personality for success. Thank you. All right, I am going to end my stream now, and one final time, thank you for listening.